Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm here today again with my friend and colleague, Dr. Aaron Lewis, a colleague of mine from the doctoral program at the University of South Florida. And he's here to talk to us today a little bit about more about his research, Reconstruction, the redemption of the South, and sort of everything that is in and around that time period in U.S. history. But I'm going to let him talk a little bit about himself and then start talking about the material for today. So it's all yours.
See, I'm definitely not going to talk about myself too much because I hate being that person. But forgive me if I do look kind of off in the distance. I'm not. I'm definitely still engaged, but I have my monitors behind me with all my notes. But yeah, like Jason said, I spoke to you guys last week, but I'm Dr. Aaron Lewis. I finished my PhD last year, and my research and my dissertation was on Southern memory, specifically with Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis, three leaders of the Confederacy, and basically looking at how white and black memory of them evolved from the end of the Civil War until the 1930s, 1940s, which will actually really, even probably better than last week, tie into what we're talking about because we're going to be talking more about specifically Reconstruction this week. So I thought I would start off with just kind of giving a brief overview about the kind of the end of the Civil War, how it ended, how it finished. Um, it was kind of a very long, drawn-out process. It was a very brutal process, as Ulysses S. Grant, who was in charge of all the Union forces, sort of adopted this modern war, this total war strategy with William Sherman. And what they did was they basically marched throughout the South. They destroyed anything and everything that might help the Confederacy, destroying farms, railroads, storehouses, weapons, food, basically, stealing horses, taking anything they could that would help hasten the end of the war. And then when it came to actually fighting was just to keep attacking over and over because they knew that the Confederacy had a much lower population and they couldn't replace soldiers in their army as easily as the Union did. So they sort of just wore them down by force, which in a way I think did lead to some of the troubles in Reconstruction, sort of the animosity between the North and the South, because many in the South did think it was a bit brutal. And a lot of historians go sort of back and forth about whether was it necessary, whether, did it actually save lives or did it just cause more problems? But we could do honestly a whole course on that probably. But in terms of Reconstruction, there's the common question is sort of how do you define Reconstruction? And really there's two definitions of it. There's two sort of, I guess, ideas that Northerners had for Reconstruction, where there was the true Reconstruction, where it was literally a reshaping of all the ideologies of the South, culturally, socially, and economically. This was led primarily by Thaddeus Stevens, who was a radical Republican in the North. He believed that obviously the South and all of its old ways should be really wiped away because that's what led to the Civil War. That was what fostered slavery and white supremacy. And then after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, you have Andrew Johnson, who's now, or was his vice president, who's now the president. And he was, despite the fact that he was the only Southern senator to not give up his Senate seat, and he stayed in Congress. And he hated the ruling class of the South. He hated the planter elite. He still was an ardent racist and white supremacist, so he didn't want to do anything that would help African Americans and basically give them more civil rights. And so he adopted the term of restoration rather than Reconstruction. That was literally just to bring the Southern states and the white people of the South back into the Union as easily as possible, change as little as possible. And so that was kind of the two competing notions of Reconstruction, which really did begin right after the end of the Civil War. And it was almost an immediate transition into that because Lincoln did have a plan. We don't really know what his plan was, nor will we probably ever know what his plan was. But this was sort of an immediate back and forth between Andrew Johnson and most of the Republicans in Congress who tended to be more radical. In terms of how the South reacted to Northerners sort of wanting to come down and reshape the South, I'm not sure if you've ever heard the term, but there's a pretty well-known term called carpetbagger. And so that was sort of a derogatory name given to Northerners who came down to the South. And so stereotypically, would profit off of the destruction of the South. So if you think about, there's a town in the South that's been completely destroyed because of the war, they might set up, a business or like a new railroad depot or something like that, and they would literally profit off of the South's misfortunes. And the reason it's called carpetbagger is because back in the day, they would have these actual they called them carpet bags that you would literally just throw over your shoulder. If you might think of like the stereotypical like old school like hobos that have the bag on a stick type of thing, that's typically what they are portrayed as. They're taking their belongings, they're coming to the South, and they're exploiting the South's misfortune. So it was a very derogatory name for Northerners, especially Republicans who came down to the South. And another term that's really important actually is also scalawag. And so that was sort of like the Southern partner of the Northern carpetbagger. So a scalawag was somebody from the South who switched allegiances from the Democratic to the Republican Party. And so that was considered, again, like the ultimate betrayal of the white South, because I don't know if Jason's gone over this with you yet, but one important thing to keep in mind is in the Civil War, after the Civil War, Republican and Democrat are pretty much flipped from what we understand today. Democrats were the party of white supremacy, pro-slavery. Republicans were the anti-slavery, more liberal party. So for white Democrats to switch to the Republican Party was considered, again, like an ultimate betrayal, stood for, and so that's where they adopted the term scalawag from. So I guess briefly, if I can get kind of talk about my own research a little bit, and then actually getting back to educating you guys a little bit more about stuff you actually need to know. When it comes to my own research, a lot of my research in the time period takes place in Reconstruction, because as I'll talk about a little later, this is around the time during Reconstruction and really after Reconstruction ends in 1877 that we start to get white Southerners really memorializing a lot of their leaders, a lot of the things that they tried to do, and a lot of the things they stood for. And so a lot of what's really important in the development of the memories and the kind of the mythical narratives of who Lee, Jackson, and Davis were, that all really starts in, I'd say, more like the 1870s. They take a little bit of a break. Tensions are actually somewhat cool after the Civil War. It was Lee actually himself who said he didn't want monuments to him, didn't want monuments to the Confederacy, because he felt it perpetuated this feeling of resentment, of bitterness, and really it was about the only good thing that Lee ever did for the United States. So it's actually fitting that he believed that, and then white Southerners, of course, were like, no, we're not going to listen to you, even though you're our monumental hero, no pun intended. So it's really 1870s and until about the 1880s, 1890s that this first wave of memorialization occurs. And of course, this coincides with what's called Jim Crow. So the Jim Crow era is actually quite extensive. It starts in the Reconstruction era, and it really goes through, I'd say, about the 1960s until we get the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so what it is, it was originally, the name was originally coined in, I think it was the 1820s, of this caricature of a Black person called Jumpin' Jim Crow. And so what the Jim Crow system or the Jim Crow laws were, was it basically, it was a legal way of keeping African Americans as close to slavery as possible. Some people use the term pseudo-slavery. With the 13th Amendment and the actual legal abolition of slavery in the United States, Southerners, particularly obviously white Southerners, wanted to find a way to keep African Americans as close to slavery as they could, because they didn't want that sort of system to end. And this sort of connects to Join My Freedom, and we'll touch upon that in a few minutes. But this Jim Crow system developed a sort of a series of laws so that primarily what would happen is they had these things called, for example, vagrancy laws. So African Americans were required to have some sort of employment or some sort of record on them to prove that they had employment, or they were helping somebody out, and oftentimes they didn't, or even if they were, the police just ignored it. And so these people would be arrested and then sort of like sold, their labor sold to the highest bidder, which technically they're free, but at the same time, based on laws in the South, they owe a certain amount of debt to get out of breaking the law. And so they're sold to the highest bidder, or their labor is, and so they're forced to work for these people for a certain amount of time to pay off this debt. So again, it's sort of the repeating of slavery without the actual you can't ever get out form of slavery. And so the Jim Crow laws were incredibly oppressive. They lasted for 80, 90 years. And it really became the defining factor of not only Reconstruction, but just sort of post Civil War in pre 1960s civil rights United States. So I guess then that's a good way to kind of go into to Joy My Freedom. So one of the themes that I like to pull out from this, and this was actually one of my favorite books when I took a class at USF. I actually read this in my very first semester at USF, but sort of the inevitability that slavery would eventually die out, which is absolutely true. I think a lot of people have this notion that, you know, if the Confederacy would have won the Civil War, then slavery would have existed perpetually. And it's that's not really the case. I mean, you'll see in a lot of countries, although they got rid of slavery by their own volition, slavery as a concept was sort of dying, because one thing that's important about a slave-based economy is that it needs constant expansion. And at a certain point, you can't expand anymore, which is what would have eventually happened in the U.S. You know, the South controlling the southwestern United States. If you've ever been to Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Southern California, it's really hard to grow cash crops there. And so at a certain point, you know, the Confederacy or the South, whatever you want to call it, they would have run out of area to keep cultivating, to keep expanding the slave economy, which is one reason why they looked to actually invade or take over Central America. Because they were very good areas for growing, for planting and growing, but obviously those plans didn't work out. And so I think in To Joy My Freedom, it shows that the inevitability of slavery was going to die out, whether or not the South did end up staying out of the Union or not. But at the same time, it's really great, this book, because it demonstrates that African Americans had a direct hand in their own liberation. This chapter in particular is really great because I think there's a lot of great stories and anecdotes that show just how much that African Americans were kind of in control and gaining control of their own lives, despite the fact that they were still in bondage. So I guess in general, the Civil War weirdly ostensibly changed the dynamic of the slave master dominant system. With the war going on, you have masters who are too preoccupied with the fighting or you know, preventing the war from sort of reaching their doorstep, that they're not able to keep the same restrictions that they normally had for slavery. Especially when you look at sort of the Atlanta case study with the new kind of urban slavery and how that sort of changed the dynamics between hiring out help to different people. You know, this whole thing allows for more autonomy on the part of the slaves. It allows them to further pursue their personal passions, exercise greater independence. But at the same time, slaves are more willing to defy their masters in the face of this changing South. I think one of the stories that I like the most, and I have it written down, so forgive me kind of looking off screen here a little bit, was the story of old Clarissa. I think that it sort of demonstrated I think was one of the best demonstrations of slaves becoming more willing to defy their masters, because with the old Clarissa story, she was sending less and less of her wages than she promised back to her master. And so the master was forced to choose between accepting this you know, reduced rate of return, or potentially losing a source of income entirely, whether he decided to sell old Clarissa or you know, chain her up or do whatever he wanted. So it's basically, do I accept this greater autonomy and this lesser amount of control over this, or do I risk having this completely cut off from my income? And so slaves being, oh yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sorry. Let me. I just want to interject because there's a lot of great information. You know, you're you're on a roll. So I apologize for interrupting you. But
You're fine.
you know, with in regard to that, you know, so obviously it seems like the end of the war is it looks somewhat inevitable that you know, slavery is going to wane to a certain extent, and particularly in the South. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but would you say that slaves at this time begin to have a bit more a better sense of agency in the face of their masters? And the other thing is, would you say that a lot of times we talk about weapons of the weak and things like foot dragging and all that with
Mhm.
factory workers and other people exposed to, say, capitalist exploitation in a different form, let's say. Would you say that these slave women, for example, engaged in foot dragging or things like that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they were finding kind of as evidenced with like Ellen in the very first couple paragraphs. I mean, they're figuring out sort of how far can they push the boundaries, and I think that really stems from the fact that they're perceiving just how destructive and life changing the Civil War is becoming. But I think it's also just coupled with that this testing of, how much worse could things get for us. I mean, we're already in bondage, and sort of, how far can I push this? And it becomes, I think, more and more clear for a lot of slaves that eventually, if you start slowly pushing back with this form of foot dragging, that eventually, if enough of them do it, it's going to potentially upend the entire system. And at a certain point, the masters or the overseers need to bend a little bit as well, just to keep everybody in line. And so at a certain point, that dam's going to break. And I think that's what we're seeing in this first chapter is them sort of testing the waters. And at a certain point, though, with the inevitability of the death of slavery, once you get to that point of them slowly sort of testing the waters, trying to stretch, maybe stretch the rubber band as a form of kind of another analogy, at a certain point you can't really go back, because how are you supposed to, as the white overseers, expected to force them sort of back into their old ways? And so I think that's what's so key about the Civil War and the immediate post-Civil War era, is that immediate testing of, what can we sort of get away with? And I think that's what's so great about To Join My Freedom, is it's highlighting these cases of African Americans that were willing to go out on a limb to try to see, what they could get away with, for lack of a better phrase. Because they do have their own agency. Like you said, they're growing their own agency. So I think that's what's so great about especially this chapter and demonstrating, is that they are able to sort of push the boundaries more, and that eventually is going to lead to an absolute explosion of civil rights, or at least in theory. And that's what unfortunately we get with the Jim Crow laws, which really kind of streamline that. And I guess that's something I can sort of move into. Or actually, first I can address, there was a quotation, actually, both of us wrote down, was that not all slave owners acquiesced to the changing conditions of slavery. What you get there is most actually, I would say, did not really acquiesce. I think they did what they could to sort of keep the status quo going. But I think in their minds, what they were really coming up with was this Jim Crow system, or even the redemption system that I'll talk about in a minute. I think white Southerners have to be given much more credit for, I guess, the ways they were able to kind of get around laws like the 13th Amendment, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. They were able to, on the state level, really keep former slaves as close to bondage as possible. And I think that's what is really highlighted in the not all slave owners acquiesce to the changing condition of slavery. In a way, they did acquiesce, but at the same time, like I said, in their own mind, they were formulating ways in which they could then just set up a new system. So their original form of slavery, the way that the slavery that they believed in was changing, but they were just looking to set up basically a new way of, or I guess a new process of pseudo slavery. So at the same time, even if you were acquiescing, it was with ulterior motives. It was to set up this Jim Crow system of the South, which I guess I can talk about the redemption of the South next, which was the best way for them to do this was to gain political power in the southern states. So one thing that was really that really did hurt Reconstruction was Andrew Johnson basically pardoning every single person who was involved in the Civil War except for Jefferson Davis. But even then, he eventually got pardoned. Because what it did was, having these open elections in the South, it allowed former Confederates and white supremacists to regain power in the South, which of course, I mean, these are the guys that formed the backbone and the bedrock of the Confederacy. if you give them the same political positions or similar political positions that they had before, of course they're going to reinstitute everything that they believed in because it's what they believe in. It's the cornerstone of their philosophy. And so that's what ended up happening. When the redemption of a state in the South meant that the governorship and I think it was just either the Senate or House of Representatives or both was once again filled by Democrats and white supremacists. So most of the South was redeemed by the 1870s. It was South Carolina, Florida, and I should know, it's one other state that was still unredeemed. I want to say Virginia by the 1876 presidential election. And the vote was really, really close between Republican, wow, I'm completely drawing a blank, Rutherford B. Hayes, and I forget who the Democrat was, I think Sam Tilden. But since it was so close, the South basically said, okay, we'll let you have the presidency, let us have I think it was Senate or governor races in the three states that were still left unredeemed. And so that was kind of the agreed upon deal. And so that sort of ended Reconstruction because all of the southern states were now back in control by the former Confederates or the white supremacists. And that was sort of the end. Obviously, there were some that tried to fight back against that, especially the federal government. They established a thing called the Freedmen's Bureau, which was sort of this overarching that meant to establish, a lot of schools throughout the South, which they did, provide jobs, education, homes for many in the South, many former slaves in the South. And they did quite a few good things. Actually, there was a number of land grant colleges or historically Black colleges and universities, so HBCUs were established. Many of the ones that are still active today were established because of the Freedmen's Bureau during Reconstruction. And they really did try to do a lot of things. Through their work, they were able to pass the 14th Amendment, which outlined citizenship rights further, and the 15th Amendment, which also talked about you can't discriminate can't discriminate for voting rights based on race, sexual orientation, and things like that. And so there were plenty of good things that were achieved, but it's really the violent overthrow of Reconstruction with the redemption of the South, and then groups like the Ku Klux Klan that really sort of ended Reconstruction prematurely. So yeah, like I talked about, the 14th, 15th, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments were great, but it was really the white supremacists that all along they sort of had this backup idea of how are we going to get around these amendments, because it's very hard not only to pass amendments, but it's really hard to take amendments away again. And so the Jim Crow laws and the redemption was sort of their local grassroots efforts to ensure that they could bypass these things and still kind of maintain some sort of an air of slavery. And so
let me I'll interject really quickly. So you mentioned the Ku Klux Klan, and they again, correct me if I'm wrong, so they become sort of a white supremacist terror force in effect shortly after the end of the Civil War. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the origins, quote unquote, of the Ku Klux Klan? And because it's my understanding that there was a time, I think prior to the Ku Klux Klan Act, that where Ku Klux Klan members felt so empowered, if I can use that word, that they would commit egregious acts against people of color in broad daylight without any mask. And so can you just kind of give us a brief background on this?
Yeah, so there were a number of white supremacist groups that popped up after the Civil War. Primarily was the Ku Klux Klan. I think that was 1866. So within a year of them of the Civil War ending, they popped up, and like you said, they were white supremacist terrorist organization. Again, heavy emphasis on the terrorist thing, because they routinely went to African American homes. They beat or murdered or intimidated them into not voting, which also further helped Democratic candidates or white supremacist candidates redeem these southern states. And so eventually, you made mention of the Ku Klux Klan Act. That was enacted by President Grant. And so basically that was a way for the federal government to put a stop to this racial violence. They've also put Union soldiers or federal troops down in the South to physically try to keep that at bay. And it did work as the Klan did disband, but then you just have other groups like the Red Shirts or the White League pop up, and they were basically just the Klan with a different name. And you're right, eventually it became so bad in the South that they were more than willing to just commit acts of violence in broad daylight or without their masks. Because frankly, I mean, who was going to stop them besides the federal government? Even the federal government got tired of it. Ulysses S. Grant, when he was president, called them the annual autumnal outbreaks because it always happened around election time. And it was super effective. I know in one county, and I think it was Mississippi, one year or for one election, a few thousand African Americans voted. During the next election, it was, I think, 4 African Americans voted. So it was very, very effective in stifling this African American vote. And it's an early form of voter suppression. That was their primary means of doing so. And although they weren't officially affiliated with the Democratic Party at the time, they were like an unofficial sort of militant branch of the party. And so there were many people in the Democratic Party that readily embraced what the Klan or the Red Shirts or the White League were doing.
Okay, good. Thanks for sort of clarifying that. It was actually my understanding that originally, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, these Klansmen would dress in white and effectively pretend to be the ghost of Confederate soldiers and attempt to spook freed slaves. That was my understanding of the sort of origins. And then I think as they saw that they were able to get away with certain acts, that it sort of evolved or devolved, I think is probably a better word, into when we think of this group, what we think of. And so I don't know if you were familiar with that at all.
In terms of the origins or the symbolism, I don't know as much. If you want to find out more, I would say a good book on that would be Behind the Mask of Chivalry by, I think it's Nancy McLean. That actually goes along with, it actually talks about masculinity in the Ku Klux Klan, because one of the motivations behind men joining it was also kind of the redemption of their manhood after they were defeated in the Civil War. So it was kind of their way to kind of regain their personal or with like inner strength sort of thing. But in terms of, I guess, the symbolism for the white, I'm not sure. I mean, that I wouldn't put it past them to have that sort of idea behind it, but I'm not entirely sure.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yep.
Yeah. And so I wanted to look at, we've talked about Reconstruction, we've talked about the redemption, and really, I guess, just to confirm, Reconstruction ends with the redemption of the South. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the 1877, when Rutherford B. Hayes is sworn in, is considered to be the final redemption of the South, and the end of Reconstruction is 1877. So absolutely. I mean, Reconstruction comes to a very violent end caused by the white supremacists of the South. I mean, it's not really, it's sort of abandoned by the North, but I think really the hand is sort of forced by, these terror attacks in the South and the forceful elections of former Confederates and white supremacists in the Southern government. So, I have to say, they did a pretty fantastic job of seizing back control in the South in such a relatively short amount of time, which is obviously super unfortunate because it created the Jim Crow oppressive era for the next 80, 90 years in the United States. And frankly, we're still dealing with effects of that today with, African Americans are still largely at a disadvantage when it comes to economics and society. I mean, typically, they are underrepresented when it comes to politics and even things like finances, and the fact that we have to have affirmative action to also give sort of the equality for not just African Americans, but other minority groups. The fact that it has to be in place because there's always been this air of sort of racism and white supremacy in the US. So you can see certainly traces of it now. And I think what it shows is you can see the traces of the failure ultimately of Reconstruction. Because I go over this with my students too, is just because the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments were passed, unless you can enforce them, they don't really matter at a certain point. And we've seen that even recently with certain laws and regulations. If you don't have anybody who's going to, call people out on the ones breaking the laws or have anybody who actually enforce them, what's the point of really having them in place? And that's what you really see in the post-Civil War and post-Reconstruction South, is that nobody really wants to go down there and bother with trying to fight the entire South to give African Americans their civil rights and their equality. And that's what happens throughout the entirety, or at least most of the 20th century too, is that people just become complacent, especially when we hit the Spanish Civil War and there's finally a way to kind of unite the country behind one cause. And I think really the 1890, or rather the late 1890s, is the true kind of nail in the coffin for African American civil rights in the South. Is they're just completely shoved aside by then, when the country comes back together to fight the Spanish-American War.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then the Spanish-American War is, and we'll talk about that obviously in a different interview. But the Spanish-American War is effectively the first time the North and the South rejoin for as a military for common common cause. And yeah, you mentioned much of the 20th century as far as moving towards civil rights and sort of dealing with civil rights for people of color. And, obviously we have the famous three evils that Martin Luther King Jr. talks about. And, of course, one of which is the evil of racism, the evil of poverty, and then the evil of war. Of course, that was at a time when, the Vietnam War was going on as well. And so yeah, you're right. And you mentioned it earlier that we, people of color were dealing with trying to get a semblance of civil rights throughout the, from post Civil War into the 1960s. So, you said 80 or 90 years, and that's, and there's still lots of work to be done. But I don't want to move too much into modern history, because I know that's something we could talk about as well. I want to move back to sort of the into the 1800s, if you will, kind of Reconstruction, redemption, and bring and talk about Tara Hunter's book, To Joy My Freedom. And she mentions that in her book she suggests that well, it's talks about Union soldiers raping Black women and destroying Black owned property. And so, and again, just to reiterate, that's Union soldiers, so the North. And so my question is, maybe help me understand this a bit more. Why would the Union soldiers do this if they were actually fighting to liberate Blacks in the South that were bound by chattel slavery? And so, I guess, in other words, if the war was, as many suggest, arguably over slavery, why would these Union soldiers have such an unfavorable opinion of Blacks and even their property? And so, if you could help me understand that, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah. So the Union Army was made up of a lot of different people. There was Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants, German immigrants. A lot of the Union Army was actually made up of immigrants. And so these different kind of groups of people had their different reasons for fighting the war. There were plenty of Union soldiers who were fighting for the liberation of African Americans, but there were also people like perhaps Irish immigrants who had typically been nearly as scorned as African Americans, not quite the same level, but who were not universally well liked in the North. So they were fighting for kind of to climb up the social ladder a little bit, to be respected more. So they might have been fighting for to kind of better the name of Irish Americans. There were also plenty that, even though they were fighting the Civil War, they felt sort of the sense to this sense of allegiance to their adopted country, but that didn't necessarily mean that they wanted African Americans to be freed. There were plenty in the North who didn't want African Americans to have freedom or to come to the North, because a lot of them figured that African Americans would be competing with them for jobs. And so what it comes down to in that is that just because the war was fought over slavery, and it certainly was, that doesn't mean that every single person serving in the Army was serving for the exact same reason. So at a certain point, you have different groups kind of within the Union Army who might be fighting for different things, even if they are fighting in the Union Army, which has a singular goal of ending the war and liberating slaves in the South. And so it comes down to this sort of personal identity level. And so that's what I would assume was probably going through some of their minds is, I'm not here to liberate African Americans. I'm here to fight for my country, to earn respect for Italian Americans or German Americans or Irish Americans who are trying to make their own life in the United States and who are, some of us, looked upon lower than whites, but maybe better than African Americans, if that makes sense to everybody.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. And, and you mentioned the railroad and you mentioned, immigrants and a lot of immigration due in large part, I would imagine, to the Industrial Revolution and people coming over from Europe, the Irish among them, of course, joining this cause for their own reasons. And so, yeah, that was really helpful. Mm-hmm. And so, in the book is focusing on at least the first chapter is focusing on Atlanta, and so Hunter talks about what Sherman and the Union Army did in Atlanta, and it was a major milestone, if you will, or turning point in the war, and so, but why? What was so significant about Atlanta?
So, I mean, it's actually a pretty simplistic answer, so forgive me if this is a little short, but Atlanta was a huge railroad hub for the Confederacy in the United States that had nearly no railroads. Railroads were really hard to come by in the United States, especially or rather in the South. So Atlanta being this sort of railroad hub, if you think about where it is, it's in northern Georgia, so it's relatively close to Tennessee. It's still close enough to the Carolinas and Virginia and even to like Louisiana. So it was a really important railroad hub. And as Hunter said, it was also a very quickly expanding place. And so to seize that, and with it being sort of in the heart of the South, was really a demonstration that the Union Army could go just about anywhere it wanted if it had the will to do so. So the fact that it fell so relatively easily showed that Sherman and his army were just sort of carving through the South however they wanted. But primarily it was the seizure of railroads and what little railroads there were in the South, which I will say, interestingly, with as few railroads as there were still railroads being built to go down to Florida. Tampa at that time in the Civil War only had 600 people, but they were still trying to get a railroad going. But yeah, it was the seizure of this railroad hub that was a really difficult blow to the Confederacy.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and you mentioned Tampa, and I believe on the East Coast, as far as railroads, I think it was Flagler, at least bringing the railroad down through Florida on the East Coast, mm-hmm. If I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. And on the Tampa side, we'll call it the West Coast, right? It was Plant that brought mm-hmm. the railroad down, and effectively was really one of the main reasons that Vicente Martinez Ybor, who founded Ybor City in the mid-1880s, decided to sort of set up shop for his cigar industry in the Ybor City. And so, yeah, the railroad, of course, it played a decisive role in the development of some of these areas. And I appreciate you clarifying that.
Yeah, of course.
You mentioned that Tampa in the 1860s, or at the time of the Civil War, and probably I would say shortly thereafter as well, only had a population of about 600. Mm-hmm. The other thing that, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but this is something that you've shared with me before, but it sort of tying this back into the what Sherman had done in Atlanta. When Sherman and the Union Army had cut off sort of access to the West as they made their way down into the South, a lot of the beef or a lot of the food, if you will, was brought up from Florida. Did I understand that when you were telling me that?
Yeah, so Texas's real contribution to the Confederacy, besides sending thousands of men, was the beef production that they had. So they were taking that from Texas, distributing it to the Union armies. And when the Mississippi fell to Union forces, they cut off Louisiana and Texas, and so the beef supply was temporarily halted. And so there was a lot of beef in Florida, specifically like central southern Florida. But if anybody knows anything about Florida, even in 2021, is that the central of Florida is mostly marshland. And it was
Mhm.
even more so during the 1860s. And so they would have to try to drive all these hundreds and thousands of heads of cattle from maybe not as far down as Miami, but a little north and central of Miami. And they'd have to try to take it all the way north, maybe to Tampa, but probably even into northern Florida or in southern Georgia, especially to Atlanta to get at the railroad hub. But Florida having so few people in it, there was actually a long one of the big difficulties with actually just kind of outlaws and cattle rustlers oftentimes would just steal cattle because it was just so uncharted. And then of course trying to get cattle through a marsh, I can't even imagine how much of a nightmare that was. So really that further demonstrates, I guess, the importance of taking the Mississippi is even though the Confederacy had other beef supplies, they couldn't really get to it as easily. And as a result, for the rest of the war, the Confederacy never really had much beef left because Florida was just so difficult to navigate with that many heads of cattle trying to go north.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's when we sit back and look at the big picture of, how railroads played a role, how, and we looked at, especially in this episode, Black agency, during this time, and military strategy, if you will, during the war, and the role Florida played. When we sort of step back and look at this bigger picture, it does give us, a better understanding, a wider understanding, if you will, of the nuanced nature of this, you know, really, this war. And so, from the human cost to, food to, ingenuity and all of that, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about this, obviously. And so, in closing, is there anything that you want to add that we sort of skipped over, or maybe I interrupted you when you were on a roll and talking about something?
No, actually, I think this ended up being a lot more detailed than even I anticipated. I tended to go off on tangents, but I think the tangents were at least somewhat relevant, which helped out. But no, I think we covered mostly everything that they should probably know about sort of the post-Civil War and Reconstruction era of the U.S. As always, they're welcome to send you questions or send me questions, and I'm happy to pass along more reading and information. But I appreciate you having me in. I appreciate for the second straight week I was able to, I guess, quote unquote, come in and share information and talk to you guys. So, as always, get in touch with me if you want to. Otherwise, thanks for having me.
Hey, appreciate it, Dr. Lewis. I really like calling you that now that you've graduated. But yeah, again, appreciate you taking the time and giving us, a deeper understanding of this time period in American history. So, thanks, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, you too.